Hey guys, Unexceptional Rounder here. Today I want to talk about controlling the size of the pot when you have a weak or medium hand. This is important to anyone who wants to make more money playing poker. It's a key element in crushing micro-stakes no-limit cash games. A little bit about pot size. If you look at this slide, it shows how bets made early on greatly affect the final pot size. We can use this information to make it much harder for our opponent to push us off hands. You can see that pot size is not linear by street. Look at the pot size bets. Goes 3.5 big blinds pre-flop, turns into 7.5 big blinds on the flop, turns into 22.5 big blinds on the turn, and 67.5 big blinds on the river. Now what happens if instead of betting the flop, we just check behind the flop in position? Well, now the river bet, even if the turn and the river are bet, that river bet now becomes 22.5 big blinds. So we greatly reduce the size of that bet just by checking behind the flop. Pot control is much easier if you have position, which is one of the explanations for why it's so important in No Limit Holdem. Plan your hand. When you hit a hand like top pair, you should decide how big you expect the pot to be. You shouldn't hit top pair and expect to win if you get all your chips in. Most of the time. It may happen sometimes, but usually people don't call off their stack with less than top pair. You shouldn't wait until you're raised to decide how you're going to react. This is one of the biggest mistakes I see people make. When you bet, you should know what you're going to do if you're raised. You should know what you're going to do on the turn, and you should plan your hand accordingly. Now, this is exactly where pot control comes into play, because oftentimes players will just bet out, and then they will not know how to react when they get raised. They won't know how to react on the turn. And so part of pot control is planning your hand. And that's one of the key takeaways that you should get from this lesson. Let's talk about when to use pot control and how it really works. When to use pot control. So the two main points here to think about when thinking about pot control is, are you protecting your stack or are you protecting your hand? What I hear people say all the time is that you should bet if there are any draws out so you can protect your hand. This kind of makes sense. You want to bet so that you have to pay people to draw against you. This is generally true if you have a big hand, but with top pair and medium strength hands, you should be thinking more about protecting your stack than protecting your hand. The other time to think about pot control is when your hand really can't stand up to a raise, but you think there are a lot of hands that your opponent could raise with. This is usually on boards with a lot of draws. Now, I want to walk through a couple different example hands so that we can go over situations where you might want to use pot control, where you might not want to use pot control, and what types of things we should be thinking about when deciding. Example hand 1. Here, we have a great example hand where pot control may be our best option. Here's the situation. We have King of Clubs, Jack of Spades on the button. We raise, the big blind is our only caller. We get a flop of 8 of hearts, 9 of hearts, Jack of Clubs, and the opponent checks to us. What should we do? Our loose passive opponent will be calling with a lot of hands in this situation. Many of those hands will have either hit this board or have a big draw on this board. In low stakes games, we play against a lot of loose passive opponents that are going to be calling with a very, very wide range from the blinds. Therefore, to keep our decisions simple and limit the opponent's ability to inflate the pot, we can check behind and exercise some pot control. Now, what I would say is, if we look at our previous slide of when to exercise pot control, I would say that this one falls under this second category. If your hand can't stand a raise, but you think your opponent might raise with a large range of hands or a wide range, that's when you might want to check behind for pot control. Here, our opponent can raise with such a wide range that we are ahead of. It doesn't really make sense for us to bet and have to fold. Our hand's not that strong. We can't stand a lot of pressure. We don't want a huge pot, but we almost always have the best hand. Great time to exercise some pot control. Let's talk about the second hand. Example hand 2. Again, we have King of Clubs, Jack of Spades on the button. The big blind is our only caller, same opponent. This time, we get a flop of 3 of spades, 7 of hearts, Jack of Clubs, and our opponent checks to us. In this situation, we can bet both to protect our hand and get value from weaker hands that may call one street. If we are raised on this flop, we can put our opponent on a very narrow range. He either has nothing and is bluffing, or he has two pair or better, or some sort of strong hand. In general, this is an easy bet fold on the flop against most passive, low-stakes players. Let's review what we talked about. We talked about what is pot control. Pot control is when you oftentimes check behind to make sure that the pot doesn't get larger than you want it to for the hand that you're playing. Why it's so important? It's important because it's a way that low-stakes players and weak players of any stake level lose a lot of money. How do we control the pot size? We talked about one specific situation where we can check behind on the flop. Now, checking behind can also apply to the turn and to the river. So there's a lot of ways that we can control the pot size. Today we just reviewed one of the main ones, which is checking behind on the flop. We also talked about when we should use pot control. Now, this is key to know when to use it. The two reasons we talked about were when protecting our stack is more important than protecting our hand, and generally that is going to be if our hand is probably good but can't stand a raise, and we expect our opponent to raise a wide range of hands. Perfect situation to check behind. And we went over a couple hands where we might decide to check behind, or where we might decide not to check behind. Well, that's all for today. If you enjoyed this video and learned something, please hit the thumbs up button. If you have any questions, please go ahead, post them in the comments. I'll reply to any questions that you have about the video. If you like getting better at poker and you want to learn more, you can subscribe in the upper left. To see the videos that you may have missed, click the annotations and they will open in new windows. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. This is Unexceptional Rounder. Until next time, keep on grinding.